I'm Robin Kochel, and Sarah, I think, do you want to share the slide deck and we'll get started?
I'm going to do that right now and just make sure that we're looking at the right view.
Yeah.
All right.
While Sarah's pulling that up, I will share that I actually grew up in Fort Worth, and so I've been familiar with Gladney for a very long time. In fact, I'm a Gladney adoptive mom. My daughter is 10 and a half now.
So Robin, I'm going to ask the Zoom question about, can you see the right screen, or are we looking at the wrong screen?
Yeah, we need to flip.
All right. How about now?
That's it.
All right. Fantastic.
All right, great. So like Nancy mentioned, my name is Robin Kochel. I'm an associate professor of pediatrics at Baylor College of Medicine and Texas Children's Hospital in Houston. I am a full-time research faculty member who studies autism. Sarah, would you like to introduce yourself too?
Sure. So Robin and I have been working together for, I don't know, Robin, I think probably 13, 14 years. It's been a really long time. So we go way back. But I am at Baylor University. I'm there in the school psychology training program. I'm a licensed psychologist and a school psychologist and a researcher at the Baylor Center for Developmental Disabilities. So really thrilled to be here. I've gotten a little bit familiar with Gladney through Robin, and just really honored to get to spend a little bit of time this morning with you also. Thank you.
Great. All right, so just to provide an overview of the topics we'll be covering today, we're first going to talk a little bit about what autism is and share some important autism statistics. I'll then review screening and diagnostic guidelines, and then talk a little about the value of early diagnosis and why this is so important relative to intervention. And then we'll review some common service recommendation, and then spend a bit of time talking about how to navigate school-based services for kids on the spectrum, and then follow up with some important resources. All right, so what is autism spectrum disorder, or ASD? So ASD is a neurodevelopmental disorder that's marked by deficits in social interaction and social communication, as well as the presence of restricted interest and/or repetitive behaviors. So in other words, autism is a condition of the brain that affects how individuals learn, behave, and interact with others. And the severity of autism exists on a spectrum, such that some individuals may be nonverbal and need significant supports at home or at school, whereas others are verbally fluent and can manage with minimal to no supports. Next slide. The main criteria for a diagnosis of autism fall into the two key areas that I just mentioned. So deficits in social communication and interaction, and restricted interests and/or repetitive behaviors. So when we talk about social communication and interaction, we're talking about difficulties in social emotional reciprocity, deficits in nonverbal communication, as well as challenges with developing, maintaining, and understanding relationships. So just to give a few examples of those types of behaviors, this would mean, difficulties maintaining eye contact, maybe not responding to name, not using words or sounds or gestures to try to communicate with others, and also, maybe failing to share things with other people, so that things the child is interested in, or maybe even shared enjoyment. And when we talk about restricted interests and repetitive behaviors, we're specifically referring to stereotyped or repetitive motor movements, use of objects or speech, insistence on sameness, inflexible adherence to routines or ritualized patterns of behavior, highly restricted fixated interests, and hyper or hyporeactivity to sensory input or unusual sensory interests. So just a few examples of what I'm talking about here would be things like maybe a child engaging in repetitive hand flapping or more complicated movements of their whole body, a child who has extreme difficulty with transitions or changes in their schedule, a child who maybe is hyper-focused on particular favorite objects, or who likes to do things over and over with their toys or objects, like lining things up, or even, being hyperreactive to certain sounds like appliances or a baby crying. Next slide. So in the past, individuals received specific diagnoses under the broader umbrella of pervasive developmental disorders. And these were autistic disorder, Asperger's disorder, and pervasive developmental disorder not otherwise specified, or PDD-NOS. However, with the move to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual 5th edition, which now we are actually in a text revision of that edition, these labels were collapsed into a single diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder. We were actually part of a research project that actually helped with that decision to decide to move to a single diagnosis of ASD. And essentially what we found is that when we looked across clinical sites where all of the clinicians were trained to the same standard using the same tools, they weren't really basing their diagnosis on specific child characteristics. It actually was more related to where they were and where they had been trained. So it just made more sense to consider all of these conditions under one umbrella diagnosis. So today, when we see individuals who've had a prior diagnosis of one of these conditions under DSM-4, we recommend that they be given the diagnosis of ASD. Next slide. All right, so some important just general facts about autism are that it represents the fastest growing serious developmental disability in the United States. So autism affects more children than childhood cancer, juvenile diabetes, and congenital heart defects combined. Autism has no medical test or cure. However, I will say that there are several research teams actively investigating potential biomarkers for autism that would hopefully make this diagnosis a bit more objective. It's also considered the most heritable among behaviorally defined disorders. So families who have one child with autism, if they have additional children, they have up to an 18% chance of having those children also meet criteria for autism. And then finally, autism occurs in all racial, ethnic, and socioeconomic groups. Next slide. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, that ASD is the fastest growing serious developmental disability in the US. And based on the most current estimates from the CDC, approximately 1 in 36 children has autism. So these figures actually just came out probably within the last month or so. And they represent a 312% increase over comparable numbers that were published by the CDC in 2000. So I've included this a snapshot of a table that you can actually find at the CDC website. The full table actually shows data beginning from the year 2000. I could only fit from 2006 here, but basically it just shows that over the past 20 years, the estimates for ASD have gone from 1 in 150 children to 1 in 36. Now I will mention that the CDC prevalence estimates, they use a particular methodology that has some limitations. So basically there are trained examiners who are culling through medical and educational records, looking for not only specific diagnoses of autism, but specific descriptors. So it's possible that some children are being captured in these prevalence estimates who actually don't have a medical or educational classification of autism. However, I have other colleagues who say, these numbers may actually be an underestimate of the true prevalence. I will also add too that there are, I can't remember exactly how many sites, maybe 11 or so sites across the country that contribute these data. There is a site in Texas. Sarah, is it one site or 2 sites in Texas that are going to be contributing?
So we're actually going to get 2 sites in Texas, and that'll be the first time. We're going to have one in Austin and one in Laredo. So
that'll be exciting. So Texas figures will now be added to these data. So that's exciting. I just want to point out too that males are more likely to be diagnosed with autism on a 4 or 5 to 1 ratio. However, that may be changing in some of our data to come as there's been an increasing interest in females with autism, what autism looks like in females, why it may be underdiagnosed, and ways that we can better detect autism in females. Next slide. All right, so what does the prevalence of autism look like specifically in Texas? So I have some data here showing you the estimates, and these are based on data from 2017, 2018 that were reported by the Texas Autism Council in April 2019. So they estimated that at that time, there were just over 26,000 children with autism between the ages of 0 and 3. Almost 72,000 between the ages of 5 and 18, and they estimated about 125,000 adults aged 19 or older. So in total, about 223,000 individuals in Texas with autism. When you think about where we need to focus kind of our efforts and services, you know, when we think about 0 to 3, this is going to be the time where we're really focusing on screening efforts, making those early diagnoses, and making sure that those kids are getting set up with early intensive behavioral interventions. Then when we focus on this 5 to 18 group, that's going to be the group that we're really starting to shift gears and think more about school-based services and provision of those types of interventions. And then, of course, when we're thinking about adolescence and moving into adulthood, that's where we're going to be focusing on our transitional services from pediatric care to more adult care. So, you know, I've just gone over the CDC numbers, and basically, when we look at that, we're estimating a 2.78% of the population has a diagnosis of autism. So when we think about that figure relative to the data of youth under the age of 19 years in Texas, we have a little over 8.2 million individuals who are less than age 19 in Texas based on the 2020 census. This, if you do the math, it basically suggests that there are over 229,000 individuals 18 or younger in Texas with autism today. So that's even more than the total figures estimated a few years back. At the end of the day, what it means is that we have a lot of individuals in Texas that have autism. Next slide. All right, so the symptoms of autism are usually evident during the first 2 years of life. And even though most parents voice concerns during this time, on average, children in the United States are not diagnosed with autism until after age 4, even though autism can be reliably diagnosed as early as 18 months, and sometimes with an experienced clinician, maybe as early as 12 to 15 months. Usually hearing or vision concerns are observed within the first year, but overall, it seems that the most commonly reported area of first concern is related to language development or speech. And some research is indicating that the average lag time between the first recognition of a developmental or a behavioral problem to eventual autism diagnosis is an average of about 32 months, ranging from 13 to about 13 months to 4.5 years. So we refer to this time lag between first concerns and eventual diagnosis as the ASD detection gap. And there's a critical need to close this large gap between first concerns and eventual diagnosis. And one way we can do this is through widespread implementation of universal screening, which has been shown to lower the age of ASD diagnosis by about 2 years. And that's important because it increases the time available for important early intervention. Next slide. Okay, so autism screening. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends autism-specific screening at 18 and 24 months. And typically this is going to happen at those well-child visits. When a child has a positive screen, meaning that it's higher risk for autism, we're suggesting that they should be immediately evaluated for ASD. Because there are such long wait lists really across the country for autism specialist evaluations, there's been a more of a push in recent times to encourage primary care pediatricians to become involved in the diagnostic process and to go ahead and make those diagnoses in very clear cases of autism. That way, we're not having children who have very obvious signs of autism sitting on wait lists and delaying their intervention services. However, in a situation where a pediatrician is not quite sure if a child is meeting criteria for autism or the clinical picture is more complex, then we always recommend a referral to an ASD specialist. And typically, when we talk about ASD specialists, this is often going to be referring to a psychologist who has expertise in autism or developmental conditions, a developmental behavioral pediatrician, or a neurologist. At the same time that we are suggesting that a referral be made, if that's the case, or if a primary care provider is going to be evaluating for autism, we also suggest a simultaneous referral for intervention so that a child can go ahead and start getting at least some of the services that are going to be helpful. Next slide. All right, so I'm sharing this roadmap with you just as an example of kind of what the diagnostic process looks like, specifically at our site here at Texas Children's in Houston. So you'll see in the bottom left corner, step 1 says to contact us. We actually require a referral by a primary care pediatrician. So that's actually going to be the first step. So this is in the situation where that PCP maybe has done an autism specific screening, a child has screened positive, there's concerns, and we're making that referral. Families will need to complete some paperwork before they can even get on the wait list. Once they do, then our social workers host a really nice waitlist workshop that they encourage families to attend. I think they do both in person and virtually, but it basically just is what to expect while you're waiting and what to expect when you actually do come in for your visit. Step 3 is actually when families come in for that evaluation. They will either see a developmental behavioral specialist or a psychologist for a comprehensive evaluation and intervention plan. After their evaluation, families, we appreciate the fact that families will have a lot of questions and may want to have some discussion with providers after they've received that diagnosis and feedback. We have a wonderful social work team that has an Autism 101 workshop, so it really helps to address some of those common questions and concerns and guides families through those next steps following a diagnosis. Again, because of lengthy wait lists, we are not routinely scheduling families for follow-up visits, probably to the same degree that we were several years ago. In those situations, though, we always do let families know, please contact us if any new concerns arise or when you're moving through those kind of key transitional periods. Again, we have ongoing workshops. Our social work team calls them pathways workshops that focus on those key transition points. So for example, from preschool years to elementary school, again in middle school, and then in high school. Of course, any families can contact us at any time if, like I said, new concerns arise. Next slide.
I just want to make like a really, first of all, I love y'all's visual that you have that you use at Texas Children's. And I just want to kind of elevate a couple of points in here. One is that this is a really nice example of a process, but we also recognize that you all are from all over Texas and outside of Texas. And so wherever you are, one of the reasons that we wanted to include this is as an example of what you might want to ask for in terms of wherever you are. So depending on what your role is or your location, just being able to have an example like this to say, hey, what's your process? And I think a lot of times, families or providers who maybe aren't working in the medical setting go, I don't even know what to ask, and this is a really great example of saying, hey, so what's your process? And maybe other places are going to have a really nice visual and it laid out and things like that. And some others might not have it written down, but they've got a process for you, or, so that the formality, I guess, may vary in terms of what they're giving you. But it's a great beginning question to be able to say to your pediatrician or to a specialty clinic. Can you tell me a little bit about your process? And the second thing I just wanted to kind of elevate from what Robin was talking about is that one of the things that you'll hear here, and I think is really critical to work with children who have autism or suspected autism, is the emphasis on the whole family. And all the way through this, what we're hearing is that, answering parents' questions, responding to concerns and things like that. And so I think, all the way throughout, really throughout the lifespan, we truly are thinking from an autism specialty focus about how do we kind of come around the entire family, recognizing that there are aspects of just getting the diagnosis and the screening and all of those things that definitely rely so heavily on the family. So just those two quick points just to elevate about what you were talking about, Robin. So I'll move to the next slide.
No, I think that's great. I was actually just going to see if these QR codes work. I think that one's cut off. The bottom one's cut off a little bit, but we are going to be sharing this slide deck with everyone. So you can scan that QR code at the bottom if you would like to subscribe to our e-newsletter that our social workers put out. So it's a really, really great newsletter that's full of nice resources. So, all right, next slide. Okay, so why is early diagnosis so important? So I think first, being able to access some types of treatments or therapies is predicated on that autism diagnosis. So that can really open the door for you to get some of the best recommended interventions. Also, early intervention of autism opens the door to services, particularly during developmental windows when they are maximally beneficial. So there's been a ton of research suggesting that the earlier that we begin to intervene, the better the long-term outcomes will tend to be. Families may also find great value in connecting with the autism community and feeling supported, particularly by those who understand their experiences and who have been walking in their same shoes. Also, earlier identification helps the family understand their child better and may help the child eventually understand him or herself better in the long run. And then finally, early appropriate interventions are shown to improve long-term outcomes for children, which also has implications for the individuals and the family's quality of life. So overall, I mean, it's just, I think there's nothing but positives to say about, why it's really important that we get this diagnosis early so that we know exactly what we're working with and what tools are best going to support that child and that family going forward. Next slide. All right. So co-occurring academic, medical, and behavioral health difficulties are common in autism. And for this reason, collaboration between medical and educational settings is key. And it's really important that this collaboration includes families as an integral part of that relationship. Oftentimes, it's actually the caregivers who are the glue between these different settings, and they're sharing what's happening in other settings, because oftentimes, you may not be able to have your medical provider in a meeting with your school personnel, your educators. And although, many providers want more interagency collaboration in practice, this doesn't just happen as frequently as we would like for it to. Next slide. All right, so some common recommendations for suspected or confirmed autism. I've just listed here probably the most common things that I see recommended for families here at our site. So number one, early childhood intervention, particularly for those young ones who are under the age of 3. Local public school services and preschool programs. So really getting families connected with their educational systems, their school districts. Applied behavior analysis. This is definitely going to be a common recommendation just because of the wealth of research support behind ABA and the wide variety of types of therapies and forms that ABA can take. Speech and language therapy is a very common recommendation, as well as parent management training, which can also be referred to as family therapy. And then a couple of really nice, I guess, resources or toolkits that we recommend. Autism Speaks, there's the link there. They have a wide variety of toolkits for all different types of challenges and situations. I highly recommend that you go there and kind of browse through their whole list. And then finally, the CDC has positive parenting tips. So this is just another great resource for supporting families who have this new diagnosis. For the rest of this presentation, we are particularly going to be focusing briefly on ECI, early childhood intervention, and then Sarah's going to pick up and really talk more about local public school systems and services that they can provide. Next slide. All right, so early childhood intervention, or ECI. So basically, ECI provides in-home services to children between the ages of birth to 3. And these are children who have a developmental delay or a developmental disability. And some of the services that they provide include developmental stimulation, speech and language therapy, occupational therapy, physical therapy, and vision and hearing impairment services. Importantly, ECI can also help with transitioning to preschool programs at age 3. So this is really nice because children who have a developmental delay or disability can actually access public educational programs at this age. They can also help with the development of an individual family service plan, or IFSP. So this really focuses on the child's present levels of development, the family strengths and needs, specific services that the child or family can use, as well as a transition plan to school services. Next slide. All right, so how to obtain ECI. To locate local ECI providers, you can call this 1-800 number listed here. Specifically in the state of Texas, you can visit this link on the Texas Health and Human Services site. If you are in a different state, I'm going to suggest maybe you Google ECI services in your state, and you will probably be able to find them. So I think it's just important to point out that families can contact ECI and initiate services with them. In Texas, though, providers are mandated to make referrals to ECI. That being said, if a provider has not made a referral yet, or you want to get a jump on things, anyone can make that referral. ECI has 45 days to complete that evaluation after the referral. Next slide. All right, so I'm going to let Sarah take over from here about transitioning from ECI to school services.
Thanks, Robin. And so just to also reiterate Robin's point about ECI services. So this actually flows, just like our school-based services we're going to talk about, actually flows from our federal law. And so the access to early intervention services in ECI is going to be something that, regardless of what state you're in, there will be programs there in your state that are specifically set up for this. We're thinking about, yes, absolutely, kids with developmental disabilities, but it's also important to know that ECI services, if we've got kiddos who have auditory and visual impairment, kids, lots of medical conditions, medically diagnosed conditions also are going to provide some eligibility for those early intervention services. And it kind of goes back to what Robin was talking about a minute ago, which is the earlier we can intervene, the better off that we are. So in terms of, that time of transitioning into school, there's a great deal of help that can come from ECI to get kiddos connected with their schools and really help navigate that transition. And that can be a really tough transition for typically developing kids. It's a tough transition to go from preschool into kindergarten, or there's some challenges, of course, exciting, but also some challenges there. And then for our kids who have developmental delays and disabilities, who have autism or suspected autism, there's some heightened challenges that are there. So having ECI services can really help. Robin mentioned an IFSP. Now, we love acronyms in these fields, and we've got a ton of them. And so an IFSP, just as a quick reminder of that individual family service plan, and in school-based services, we have even more acronyms. So those plans, though, are extremely individualized, or that's the intention is for them to be very individualized and to help set kids on that trajectory for some great success as they move into school. There's some timelines timelines really can vary from state to state a little bit. So make sure that if you're not in Texas, that, just take some of those timelines and some of those nuances with a grain of salt. As Robin said, making sure in your state that you're taking a look at the websites and timelines and things like that. But any parent of a kiddo who's 3 years old or can request an evaluation within their public school district beginning at 3 years old. And actually right before 3 years old, you can start getting connected with your school district so that you have that plan in place. ECI is going to help with that if the child is already connected. And if they're not, parents are welcome to make that request of the school district themselves. And so that's the school district, the public school district, wherever they are living or wherever they reside. There are some things that we highly recommend also to families as they're starting to make that transition into school. Things like going to the classroom, connecting with that teacher, sharing some information, really just kind of laying the foundation for some great communication habits, asking the teacher, what kinds of things are they going to be expected to do in the classroom or at school? How can we help practice that at home? And, set some things up like that. So just developing some early and strong relationships, keeping tabs on progress of what's happening at school and asking the teacher. And that can also be some good communication, or it can be an outflow of a good communication foundation. It's just this ongoing kind of conversation about how are things going in school, and what can we do to continually support that. As parents or as providers from other organizations or agencies or offices, being willing to share your own observations and concerns and things like that. And really, from the very beginning, I think that thematically, what I hope that you'll hear is that the goal is to develop as much collaboration and communication as we possibly can to support kids and families. There's a little note down here, PPCD, and then the arrow to ECSE. Not only do we love acronyms in this business, but we also sometimes change them up. So if you're familiar with PPCD, the Preschool Program for Children with Disabilities, we now have a new acronym, and this is Early Childhood Special Education, ECSE. And so if you hear that and you're like, well, what happened to PPCD? It's the same thing, but we do have a new acronym as of just within the past couple of years. So ECSE is something that is you can begin having these services if you're eligible. And usually if you have an autism diagnosis, you're eligible for ECSE through your school district. Now, the important thing, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in the next couple of slides, is that even if you have an autism diagnosis or an ASD diagnosis from an outside provider, the school district is obligated by law to do their own evaluation. Having that outside diagnosis can be extremely helpful, and in some cases, it streamlines the process enormously. In others, it is a piece in that puzzle. So there's a difference between having a school-based eligibility and having a medical diagnosis or an outside of schools diagnosis. And I think sometimes that's really confusing, and it can be really challenging for families or outside providers, or even, Robin and I work a lot with primary care physicians and practices, and even, people who are serving kids on the spectrum in other settings. That disconnect between you have to have a new evaluation in school can be super confusing, and also for families. So that's a really important thing to recognize. In Texas, the referral process can begin about 90 days before the third birthday, or anytime between that age 3 and 5 years. Also in Texas, schools have 45 days to complete their evaluation. And as we mentioned before, if they're already getting ECI services, then the ECI service provider can help get that process started early on. If they're not, then the family can request that evaluation. And on our resources slide at the end, we've got some hyperlinks there. There are some examples of letters. So if you're working with families, if you are a family, you always want to make sure that you're getting everything in writing also. And we've got some examples there of letters if you're wanting to make a referral for school-based evaluation. So the schooling really is a very critical consideration, and best practices, Robin mentioned this before, but having these really strong partnerships is absolutely critical. As we've seen the diagnostic prevalence for autism rise outside of schools, we see a concurrent increase in the need for school-based services, particularly in the autism category. And when I say the autism category, within public school services, we, under the federal law, we serve children under a variety of what we call disabling conditions. And autism is one of those disabling conditions that we have under the law, but other ones that we have, specific learning disability, visual impairment, auditory impairment, other health impairment. So there's a variety of federal classifications. Autism is one that we've seen a steady increase, which makes sense alongside our diagnostic prevalence increase outside of schools. Importantly, though, we have about half of kids. Now, these statistics can shift a little bit depending on what type of data collection we're looking at, but about half of kids who have an autism diagnosis only get that autism diagnosis from the school. So having these partnerships between different settings of where kids can get the diagnosis is really, really important for a variety of reasons. And that's one of them as well, because some kids aren't going to get a diagnosis outside of school. It's going to come only from the school. Lots of times, kids and adolescents also with autism need school-based programming, supports, and services. There's a saying in the autism community that if you know one person with autism, you know one person with autism, right? So there's an enormous amount of difference or variability in how kids function. And Robin mentioned this earlier, but how kids function, how much speech and language they have, how much behavioral regulation that they have, how much support that they need. We try to account for that within an initial diagnosis and link our recommendations to that. For treatment or intervention or service provision. But we also recognize that as kids get older, their needs change, just like typically developing kids. And so we want to constantly be keeping tabs on how are things progressing? These are some of the areas that kids may need some school-based programming, supports, and services for. So academic skills probably makes a lot of sense because we think about the academic aspects of schooling, but certainly that's just one small part of what schooling is all about. And so we also want to help them from a school perspective to develop behavioral supports, to develop that social and emotional functioning, social difficulties and differences being at the very core of autism, regardless of measured cognitive ability or IQ, or regardless of language ability. That social, the social skills and social functioning is really at the heart of autism. And so we want to make sure that we target that and provide some good supports for kids wherever they are. Life skills or adaptive behavior and those skills toward independence. That's our goal. We want to maximize any child's ability to have the most independence that they can. And then, of course, communication skills as well. So these are some of the areas that school programming can really target throughout the lifespan. School-based services for kids with ASD, third birthday is when they become eligible. So that's a really important piece. They might be eligible, or they might get that specialized preschool program, speech language. So Robin mentioned several different things that we usually see in recommendations that are pretty, I guess, standard or traditional recommendations, because they map on really nicely to the areas of difficulty for kids on the spectrum. And what we need for getting school-based services, another acronym here, an FIE, or a full and individual evaluation through the family zone school. So wherever the family is going to school, that's the office that we go to. So that special education, or even the local elementary school, and say, hey, where do I start? I want to make this referral, and kind of get started from there. I mentioned this before, but this is a point that's worth repeating, because we see this we work with schools, we work with pediatricians, we work with families, and on all ends, this is confusing. So eligibility is decided in schools, and it unlocks the door to special education supports and services. A diagnosis is coming from our DSM, and this is provided in medical or private or really any non-school-based setting. And this is what's unlocking the door to insurance reimbursable services. That being said, there are, and it depends on the state and also the insurance plan, that will take a school-based eligibility. So even though some of this stuff is kind of nuanced, and if it's new information to you, there's also some more information that we have linked in our resources to sort this out. But sometimes this by itself, just helping families to understand that there's a difference in the two settings, can be really empowering, because it can help them to say, okay, I know that I need two different things. Even if I have an outside diagnosis, I know I still need to get this school-based process going. This is a table of just some of the differences, and the IDEA is something I'm going to talk about that acronym here in just a second, but that's our federal law. The DSM is our diagnostic manual for not just for autism, but for everything that as psychologists that we're looking at and that we diagnose. But these are some similarities and differences. I'm not going to belabor this point just in the interest of time, but this just kind of breaks down a little bit about what's different about these two approaches to getting these diagnoses or classifications, and what's similar about them as well. And that's a really important piece. I think that's where some of the confusion comes in, is that there's a lot of similarity between what we're really looking at, but what really differentiates them is what does it provide access to. So the IDEA, so let's talk about that for a moment here. So the IDEA, this is our federal law, and there's multiple parts of it. We've got 4 parts. The 2 that are really of concern to us here today are Part B, and Part C. And actually Part C, Robin's already talked about, which is the early intervention services. And so the federal law mandates that when we know that kids have early difficulties from a medical, developmental, physiological perspective, that we want to provide them and their families access to supports and services as soon as possible. So these services under Part C do cover early intervention services, and this is birth through 3 years old. When we hit 3 years old, Part B kicks in. And now we have services for school-age children or special education services. And under Part B, and that's what we're really going to spend the rest of our time today talking about, is that the federal law tells us under Part B that it requires schools to serve educational needs of students with disabilities, including autism or ASD. Free and appropriate public education is ensured under the federal law, and families can request that eligibility at any time. So if you're a family member, if you're a provider on here and you're working with somebody who's got, if you've got a 14-year-old and they've never been evaluated and you have a concern, you can request an evaluation at any time through your local school district to determine eligibility for services, potential services. The IDEA, really importantly, gives families an equal say in decisions about a child's educational goals. This can also sometimes be really overlooked. If you've ever been to an IEP meeting, or in Texas, we call these ARD meetings, admission review and dismissal meetings. But if you've ever been to one before, then you know that it's attended by lots of different professionals, with the goal being, let's get everybody in the room who might be able to, or who's going to be able to provide some good guidance on what we can do to best support this kiddo. So we've got a lot of professionals in the room, and then we've got also the family there as well. And sometimes families can really feel outnumbered and maybe disempowered to be, to feel like that their voice matters. But it's so critical that we hear from families, and the federal law actually tells us this is a necessity as well. It's a legal requirement. So IDEA really does give families an equal say in the decisions about their kiddos. Very quickly, structure of special education, just to kind of know how all of this stuff goes together. Obviously, the very most important part of this is kiddo, who's at the very center. So that child. Children do not exist in a vacuum, as we know, as parents, as providers. So that says child right there, but it really is that child and family. The federal law supersedes all other aspects of our, state or SEA, state education agency, and then school district or local education agency. The state law has to follow the federal law. They can go beyond the federal law in terms of what they're going to provide or what they offer, but they can't go below that federal law. So if they want, really, it comes down also to money. If they want money from the federal government to subsidize the programming for kids with disabilities, then they also they have to follow that federal law. Now, school districts oftentimes put in policies and procedures in order to make those federal or their state and federal regulations happen. The reason I bring this up here is because we've got people from all over Texas, much less all over the country as well, who are listening in today. And the policies and procedures about how things might go, just like we were looking at that map that Robin had earlier of the service navigation with Texas Children's Hospital may vary from practice to practice, but the ideas are going to be the same. And the same thing is happening here when we talk about school districts. Policies and procedures are going to be a little bit different from who do you contact, where do you send the letter, who do you talk to, who's going to manage your child's special education case and shepherd it all the way through, who's running the IEP meeting, what kind of documents or paperwork that might be required or used within that district to do that full and individual evaluation. But at the heart of it, those procedures have to follow also those state and federal guidelines. So there's similarities, but enough differences, again, to create some confusion potentially as well. So just being aware of that. In terms of special education, it's the most important part of this is that special education is not a place. Long time ago, we really, I think that the visual, and maybe it still is in the mind of some of us who've been around for a few decades, is that special education was a place, and that kids were separated out. Certainly there are times that having highly individualized and highly structured environments for kiddos who require an enormous amount of support is going to be the best fit for them, at least in particular aspects of their schooling. But the federal law tells us that we want to educate kids and have them in that school environment to the greatest degree possible. So that least restrictive environment comes up as part of our federal legislation. Every child's needs are different, and this is why we want to have individual plans for each child. That's that IEP, or individualized education plan. As I mentioned before, that federal legislation and case law is tied to finances or money, and also penalties. And so you can if you're interested in taking a deep dive, I can completely geek out on this, like special education law stuff. I will not do that today, but it is really very interesting. And I think that it's so important because it brings into, it codifies things that we know in terms of ideally what are things that we know need to happen in order to place some structure and provide access to high quality education and programming for our kiddos. These are a few of the services that could be provided through special education. This is not exhaustive, and it is also, it doesn't, just because it's on this list doesn't mean that every single child can have it. But I put it up here just so that you can see, again, that parallel, that mapping on. There's some things that we recommend, and then some of these things absolutely can be provided through schools. So instructional services, related instructional services like classroom programming. In Texas, this includes speech language therapy, but that is not the case in every state. So that's another little state to state nuance, but also related services. So counseling, occupational therapy, parent training, rehab services, school health, all of those things also can be provided through special education. Supplementary aids and services. So some kids need adaptive communication devices. That can also be provided through the school district if it's determined, hey, this is what this kiddo needs in order to be able to access their educational programming. In Texas, we also have an autism supplement. It's the only disabling condition that we have these extra strategies for, and these have to be considered within the IEP. If you want more information about that, this is also a really interesting document. It maps on nicely to things that we know from research are helpful to kids who are on the spectrum. You can take a look at that on that link as well. Kids who are served by special education, just to get an idea about, what this looks like. These data are from 2019 to 2020, but 7.3 million US students were served under IDEA, or 14%. About 11% of those 14% have an autism. And what we've seen, Robin mentioned having a 312% increase since 2000 in the diagnostic prevalence outside of schools. Inside of schools, we've seen a 684% increase of students with autism in the past 20 years. This has been an enormous growth. So about 43% of an increase per year on average. The overall special education growth has been 0.5%. So just kind of give you a picture of the differences there. The accessing special education, this is not nearly as beautiful as a map of what you saw with the Myers Center, but this kind of walks you through what these different steps are. So identifying the condition and the related special education need, that's the critical piece of it. So having a diagnosis can be extremely helpful of streamlining the services, but what the school is determining in that FIE is, does the child have a related educational need? After that, we're creating that individual programming for a kiddo, making sure that everybody who's involved with the child, especially the family, but also our teachers, school personnel, to the extent that they want to be involved, or outside providers as well, ensuring stakeholders understand and they're prepared for that programming, putting that program into place. And then we're going to continually evaluate success of that program. Every single year, we're going to get back together and have an IEP meeting more often if needed, or if the parent requests it. And we don't wait until the IEP meeting. Ideally, we don't wait until the IEP meeting to be communicating about progress and things like that. Parents can ask about that at any point. And then every single year, we need to be thinking about, okay, what needs to change? What needs to update? As a side note, if you have a kiddo who has an IEP and the goals are the same from year to year, that's something to push back on, because we do want those goals to be changing every single year. We want to see progress, and we want to see, how are we going to measure that process? So this is just a really quick sneak peek about how, what that process of special education looks like as we go through the process. Parents, again, have lots of rights. So we've mentioned about, hey, if you're concerned about your child or somebody else's, you can make a referral to the public school district and say, hey, I'd like to have an evaluation, an FIE for my child. The school does have to either evaluate or respond in writing to why they won't evaluate. Let's say that they evaluate the child and they say, yes, we do see a disabling condition and a related educational need, and here's the programming that we would offer, or the placement that we would offer. The parent does not have to accept that. They really are key decision makers within the IEP meetings. There is a right to other evaluations. If they are not happy for various reasons with the school evaluation, they do have a right to request other ones. They can ask for compensatory services if the evaluation timeline, again, I mentioned the evaluation has to be done in 45 days in Texas. So if that isn't followed, then, the parent has rights in that way as well. And I've mentioned before too, they can ask for meetings at any time. I put these things up just as some examples of parents being key within this process. And it really is important for them to understand and to be empowered by us as professionals as well, to say, hey, let me draw you in and help us to serve your child best. Some of the things here, we've actually already gone through, I think, all of these. So this is just kind of a summary slide. To just say, if you think your child might need special education, remember, not a place, but supports and services in that local school district, then these are just kind of a summary of some of the things we've already gone through to how to access those services. And there is a link that's down here, the IDEA manual for parents. I think it's a great resource, and you can take a look at that. And there is a sample letter. And I think in some of our other resources that we provided as well, some sample letters for you. So on that note, these are some resources for you. We try to include, now, for those of you who are outside of Texas, yes, the Texas Project First does have some very specific Texas things, as you would probably imagine, but there's also some things that have great generalizability as well. So we have some resources here for families, for other providers, some national and some state-specific documents, also documents in English and in Spanish. Robin mentioned Autism Speaks. They actually have their and many of their toolkits translated into multiple languages as well. So if you're a provider and you're working with families who speak various languages, this might be a great place for you to go as well.